At the heart of Beijing, hidden behind towering crimson walls and golden rooftops, lies a place once veiled in secrecy and power. The Forbidden City was not simply a palace. It was an entire world within walls. A city that none could enter without imperial permission. A labyrinth of courtyards, pavilions, gardens, and halls where emperors ruled not just a nation but a civilization. For nearly 5 centuries, it served as the beating heart of the Chinese Empire, the stage upon which dynasties rose and fell, and the silent witness to rituals, schemes, triumphs, and tragedies. The story of the Forbidden City begins in the early 15th century with Emperor Yongle of the Ming dynasty. A ruler of immense ambition, Yongle had already shown his boldness by seizing the throne from his nephew in a bloody civil war. Once power was his, he turned his eyes to the north. He moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing and ordered the construction of a new palace complex that would reflect the majesty and divine authority of the emperor. It would be nothing less than a cosmic center, a replica of the universe in architecture, layout, and symbolism. Construction began in 1406. It would take over 1 million workers, including craftsmen, artisans, convicts, and slaves, more than 14 years to complete. Materials were transported from across the empire. Giant timbers were floated down rivers from the south. White marble came from nearby quarries. Even special bricks were baked and brought from Suzhou. Everything was calculated, nothing was left to chance. The city was built according to strict Confucian principles and geomantic rules of feng shui. The emperor's palace had to align with the axis of heaven. The colors, shapes, and positions of buildings were meant to reflect cosmic order. When it was completed, the Forbidden City was a marvel of scale and design, enclosed by a 10-meter-high wall and a 52-meter-wide moat. It covered 180 acres, with nearly 1,000 buildings and more than 8,000 rooms. Every corner was adorned with symbolism. The dominant color was red, signifying happiness and prosperity. The rooftops were glazed in yellow tiles, the color of the emperor. Dragons curled along beams, guardian beasts perched on rooftops. Even the number of steps in a staircase carried meaning. But beyond architecture, the Forbidden City was built to control. It controlled movement, hierarchy, and access. There were strict protocols for who could walk where, who could speak to whom, and how often they could be seen by the emperor. For those who lived within its walls, concubines, eunuchs, ministers, guards, the city was both a prison and a universe. Days were governed by ritual, seasons by ceremony. The emperor was the son of heaven, and all things revolved around his presence. Yongle himself rarely rested. His reign was filled with grand projects. He dispatched treasure fleets under Admiral Zheng He to sail the Indian Ocean. He launched military campaigns into Mongolia and Vietnam. But even as he reached outward, his gaze never left his capital. The Forbidden City became his anchor, a place where heaven met earth, where the emperor could perform his sacred duties at the heart of the world. And yet, even in this space built to be eternal, change came. Emperors aged, dynasties weakened, power shifted from throne to court, from sovereign to servants. The Forbidden City, with all its majesty, could not hold back the tide of time. Behind its brilliant facade, whispers grew louder, intrigue thickened. Eunuchs rose in influence, forming secret networks and manipulating succession. Scholars lamented the decline of virtue. And still, the rituals continued, unchanged, unbending, like clockwork in a world slipping slowly out of balance. Outside the walls, the world was changing, too. The Ming dynasty, for all its splendor, faced internal rebellion and external threat. Natural disasters, famines, and corruption weakened the state. In 1644, the capital was breached by rebels, and the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the garden behind the palace. The Forbidden City, symbol of divine authority, was open to conquest, but it did not fall into ruin. The Manchus, founders of the Qing dynasty, took it over and kept it alive. They respected its structure, its rituals, its symbolism. They became emperors of China but never abandoned their heritage. The Forbidden City now housed rulers who wore the dragon robe but also braided their hair in Manchu style. Once again, the city adapted. Once again, it became the center of the empire. as the Qing dynasty settled into the heart of the Forbidden City. The rhythms of imperial life resumed with little change. The same sun rose over the same red walls. The same protocols governed how ministers bowed, how concubines dressed, how meals were prepared for the emperor. To the outside world, it appeared that the mandate of heaven had simply passed from one dynasty to another, with the Forbidden City as the constant, unshaken axis around which everything else revolved. Yet under the surface, there were quiet shifts. The Manchu rulers brought with them their own customs and languages. While they embraced the Confucian rituals of statecraft, they retained many traditions of their steppe heritage. They hunted, they spoke Manchu in private, and they managed dual bureaucracies, one in Chinese, one in Manchu. This dual identity played out behind palace walls, where a Qing emperor could host Confucian scholars in the morning and don furs for archery practice in the afternoon. The palace complex remained vast and orderly, with its zones of access carefully preserved. At the very center stood the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where coronations and major ceremonies took place. Just behind it were the halls where the emperor conducted daily affairs of state. Farther in were the inner courts, private spaces for the royal family. Here, surrounded by high walls and tight rules, concubines lived lives of luxury and loneliness. Some never saw the world beyond the palace gates again after entering. At the heart of it all was the emperor, both exalted and imprisoned by tradition. He rose before dawn. Attendants helped him dress. Ministers presented memorials in the Hall of Mental Cultivation, where decisions that affected hundreds of millions were made in silence, with careful words and deep bows. Meals were selected from hundreds of dishes, each one tasted by eunuchs before reaching his table. Even his leisure, painting, calligraphy, or garden walks, was shadowed by protocol. The Forbidden City was not just a building. It was an idea made real. The layout symbolized cosmic order. The gates, aligned with cardinal directions, mirrored the balance of yin and yang. The number 9, considered the most powerful, was woven into everything, from the number of studs on doors to the arrangement of rooms. Every sound, every color, every space was chosen to express authority, harmony, and permanence. And yet, even here, time crept in. The Qing emperors, especially in the early generations, ruled with diligence. Kangxi, Yongzheng, and Qianlong were strong, intelligent, and deeply involved in governance. Under their rule, the Forbidden City was a hive of intellectual activity and artistic patronage. Libraries expanded, new gardens were designed, craftsmen from across the empire brought their finest work to adorn the halls. The palace glowed with poetry, painting, and porcelain. But after Qianlong's long reign ended in the late 18th century, decline began. The emperors that followed lacked his energy or vision. Bureaucracy thickened, corruption festered. Eunuchs, long dismissed by Qing founders, once again grew powerful, whispering behind screens and shifting the gears of court politics. And outside, beyond the crimson walls, China was changing. Western powers knocked at the empire's doors. The Opium Wars brought humiliation. The Taiping Rebellion shook the very foundations of Qing authority. Foreign diplomats demanded access. Treaties carved the nation into spheres of influence. And still, within the Forbidden City, rituals continued unchanged. Ministers still bowed 3 times and knocked their heads to the floor. Ceremonial drums still beat in the courtyards. But the illusion of timeless order was fading. One figure came to dominate the twilight of the Qing era, Empress Dowager Cixi. Entering the palace as a low-ranking concubine, she rose through intelligence and shrewd political maneuvering to become the de facto ruler of the empire. From behind a silk screen, she guided emperors, dismissed rivals, and held court with iron resolve. For nearly half a century, she shaped the course of China, not with armies, but with strategy. And though historians still debate her legacy, there is no question that she was one of the most powerful women to ever walk the stone paths of the Forbidden City. Under her, the palace was both preserved and politicized. She undertook renovations, restored halls, and expanded gardens, but she also resisted reform, fearing that change would unravel the very fabric of power that held the empire together. As the 20th century approached, the Forbidden City stood still, a frozen world of etiquette and ceremony, surrounded by a country in upheaval. Outside the walls, railroads were built, telegraph lines buzzed with news. Revolutionary ideas spread. Inside, the emperor still performed rituals from a scroll written centuries ago. Lanterns still swung from carved beams. The imperial kitchen still prepared thousands of dishes. But cracks had formed. The center could no longer hold. And in 1908, when the boy Emperor Puyi ascended the throne at just 2 years old, the weight of centuries rested on his small shoulders. He would be the last to rule from behind the golden screens. The world he inherited had already begun to vanish. When the 2-year-old Puyi was placed upon the dragon throne in 1908, the Forbidden City was already a relic of a waning age. The boy emperor, dressed in ornate silk and surrounded by the grandeur of tradition, had little understanding of the world he had inherited. He played with toy soldiers on lacquered floors, while outside the gates of his palace, an empire teetered on the edge of collapse. The Forbidden City, for centuries the center of absolute power, had become an island adrift in a sea of change it could no longer resist. In 1911, just 3 years into Puyi's symbolic reign, revolution erupted. The Qing dynasty, weakened by decades of corruption, foreign invasion, and failed reforms, fell swiftly. China was declared a republic. And yet, in a strange and delicate compromise, Puyi remained in the Forbidden City. Though stripped of his imperial authority, he was allowed to live within the inner court, attended by eunuchs and protected by ancient rites. It was a shadow of monarchy, a child emperor wandering through echoing halls, ruling nothing but memory. Inside the palace, the rituals continued. He rose before dawn, ate meals from golden dishes, listened to music composed centuries earlier. But outside, the world moved on. Warlords battled for control, new governments rose and fell. Modern schools opened, trains connected cities, Western clothing and ideas spread through Beijing. Yet within those red walls, time seemed frozen. The air hung heavy with incense. The paintings, scrolls, and ceramics remained untouched. Servants still whispered down long corridors. And the emperor, now more a prisoner than a ruler, looked out through carved lattice windows at a city that no longer obeyed him. Puyi's strange life within the Forbidden City continued until 1924. When the warlord Feng Yuxiang forced him to leave, soldiers surrounded the gates. His possessions were searched. The last emperor, now a young man, was expelled from the only world he had ever known. For the first time in 500 years, the Forbidden City no longer housed a ruling sovereign. The Son of Heaven walked out through the gate of divine might. Not in glory, but in silence. After his departure, the Forbidden City entered yet another phase of transformation. It became a museum, a monument to a vanished age. For the first time, ordinary citizens could walk where only royalty once tread. They wandered through vast halls, peered into thrones, marveled at treasures once hidden from all but the privileged few. The awe remained, but the power was gone. The city that had once shaped the fate of an empire was now a place for memory, not command. Through war and occupation, the palace endured. During the Second Sino-Japanese War, the most precious artifacts were packed into crates and transported far away for safekeeping. Curators risked their lives to preserve centuries of art and culture. Some treasures made their way to Nanjing, then to Sichuan, and eventually to Taiwan, where they would become the foundation of the National Palace Museum in Taipei. Others remained hidden beneath floorboards and behind false walls in Beijing, protected from bombs and looters alike. The Forbidden City itself was not untouched by violence. Fires damaged several halls. Looters took their share during chaotic times. But the bones of the city, its vast courtyards, layered rooftops, carved stone paths, remained. And as the People's Republic of China emerged in 1949, the new government faced a question: what to do with this imperial relic? This symbol of hierarchy and feudalism? At first, the palace stood in uneasy tension with the ideals of revolution. But eventually, it was embraced not as a monument to monarchy, but as a treasure of the people. The Forbidden City became the Palace Museum, and efforts began to restore and protect its structures. Art and archives, teams of artisans, historians, and architects worked to stabilize ancient beams, repaint faded murals, and catalog vast collections of ceramics, scrolls, and imperial robes. The city opened its gates wide. Students, workers, families, all were welcome to walk where emperors once walked. The red walls no longer forbade entry. The city once hidden from the people became theirs to explore. And yet, the air inside remained different. A hush fell upon visitors as they stepped onto the stone causeways. As if the silence of centuries still echoed between the eaves. The Forbidden City stood not only as a place of history, but as a symbol of endurance. Through dynastic change, foreign occupation, revolution, and restoration, it had remained quiet, unyielding, full of shadows and stories. It was a place where time layered itself like dust, where the present could never fully escape the presence of the past. And so, while Puyi lived out his final days in anonymity, writing his memoirs and reflecting on a life shaped by forces far beyond his control, the city that once held his throne welcomed the world. Its halls no longer whispered only to emperors. Now they whispered to all. As the decades moved on and China stepped further into the modern world, the Forbidden City stood as both a reminder and a relic. Beijing rose around it, with new buildings, highways, and towers encircling the ancient walls. But nothing matched the silent gravity of the palace at the city's core. Even amid political movements, shifting ideologies, and rapid urbanization, the Forbidden City remained a center that no longer held power, yet held something just as enduring: memory. During the tumultuous years of the Cultural Revolution, the Forbidden City faced one of its most dangerous moments. Zealots saw the palace as a symbol of old China, of feudalism, hierarchy, and oppression. Red Guards, eager to smash the past and remake the future, turned their attention toward its halls. Statues were toppled elsewhere, temples were burned, and books were destroyed. Yet here, in the heart of Beijing, the palace was largely spared, thanks to a combination of strategic intervention by Premier Zhou Enlai and the quiet bravery of museum staff. Many treasures were hidden, many buildings protected. Still, not all was preserved. Some ancient structures were defaced, some artifacts lost. But in a time when history itself was under siege, the survival of the Forbidden City felt almost miraculous. When the dust settled, when slogans faded and the world looked toward healing and rebuilding, the Forbidden City was still there, weathered, but standing. In the years that followed, a new kind of attention began to form around the old palace. No longer feared as a symbol of the past, it became cherished. Scholars returned to study its architecture and calligraphy. Artisans came to restore faded paintings and repair tiled roofs. Tourists, both local and foreign, began to visit in growing numbers. What had once been a world behind walls became one of the most visited museums on Earth. The transformation was slow, but profound. Restoration projects, guided by historians and craftsmen, aimed not only to preserve the physical structures but to understand the stories behind them. Who had lived here? Who had walked these paths? What decisions were made in these quiet rooms? What secrets remained behind carved wooden doors? A new generation of Chinese people began to see the Forbidden City not as a fortress of emperors, but as a reflection of their shared heritage. The bricks and beams were no longer the property of rulers, they belonged to the people. And in that shift, something remarkable happened. The Forbidden City became more alive than it had been in a century. Modern technology deepened the connection. Virtual tours brought distant visitors into the throne rooms. Digital archives allowed scholars to access centuries-old documents. Documentaries explored the daily life of palace workers, the methods used in construction, the subtle symbolism carved into every surface. Children visited with school groups. Elderly couples strolled through the gardens. Artists sketched the curved rooftops while tourists from around the world stood in awe under the bright northern sun. But even as its role changed, the palace retained its aura. There was still something in the way the light struck the yellow tiles, in the hush that fell over the hall of supreme harmony, in the creak of old wood under careful footsteps. The city still held echoes of voices long gone, of emperors and empresses, of scribes and soldiers, of servants who rose before dawn and whispered through endless corridors. The spirit of the Forbidden City was never in its gold or jade. It lived in the quiet order of its design, the way one courtyard opened into another, always with a sense of balance and flow. It lived in the patterns of movement, the discipline of ritual, the belief that even architecture could reflect cosmic harmony. And though dynasties had passed, though ideologies had shifted, that spirit remained. For centuries, the Forbidden City had been closed, forbidden to all but a few. Now, it welcomed millions, yet its mystery was never diminished by exposure. If anything, its presence deepened, because what stood behind those walls was not just history, it was continuity. A line of memory drawn from emperors to citizens, from calligraphy to touchscreen exhibits, from incense to camera flashes. Today, it no longer governs, it no longer commands, but it watches, and it teaches, about power, beauty, transience, about how even the most sacred spaces can fall silent, and how silence itself can be sacred. Each year, as the seasons change, the Forbidden City changes with them. Snow softens the rooftops in winter. Peach blossoms brighten the courtyards in spring. Summer brings green shadows to the garden paths. And in autumn, the leaves turn gold, just like the tiles. The city breathes, not as a ruler, but as a witness. And somewhere, in a quiet chamber, far from the main gates and crowded halls, the past still whispers, not loudly, just enough for those who are willing to listen. Time has a way of softening even the hardest walls. The Forbidden City, once a place of absolute authority, now exists in a gentler role, an elder among buildings. A monument not to domination, but to endurance. Its walls no longer hold emperors, but they hold echoes. Its gates no longer open for court officials, but for children, scholars, dreamers. It no longer commands from the center of the world, but it remains at the center of memory. The palace has witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties, the sweep of revolutions, and the quiet return of reverence. It has stood under clear skies and choking smoke, heard the clash of blades and the hush of 1,000 bowed heads. Through it all, the Forbidden City has remained, watching, absorbing, reflecting. It is more than wood and stone. It is a vessel of time. Today, visitors walk the stone paths once reserved for emperors. They pause before gilded thrones and faded scrolls, trying to imagine what life was like when each hall pulsed with purpose. The air still feels heavy with formality, as if every echo carries a story too proud to disappear. And somewhere, in a quiet corner, a faded inscription or a forgotten chamber reveals another thread of a tale that spans 6 centuries. But no visitor truly sees the Forbidden City whole. No single pair of eyes can take in the totality of its structure. Its stories, its silence, the sheer scale resists that. It's too vast, too layered. Each wing, each gate, each shadowed corridor holds a different part of the puzzle. The concubine's sigh, the scholar's scroll, the eunuch's hurried footsteps before dawn, the emperor's lonely gaze out toward the north gate. It is a place where humanity was hidden behind ritual, where love was dictated by hierarchy, where ambition, fear, wisdom, and cruelty all wore the same silk robes. And yet, within that constraint, individuals still lived. They left behind poems carved into beams, embroidery tucked into drawers, songs hummed behind painted screens. These were not just stories of rulers, but of people, quiet lives beneath golden roofs. In recent decades, great efforts have been made not just to preserve the palace but to understand it more fully. Hidden rooms have been uncovered. Long-lost archives have been restored. Conservators painstakingly remove layers of dust to reveal the vivid pigments of ceiling murals. Historians pore over calligraphy, deciphering names and dates lost to time. And each discovery, however small, adds to a portrait that is still incomplete, still unfolding. Perhaps that is the true legacy of the Forbidden City. Not that it ever represented perfection or divine rule, but that it continues to offer questions. It makes us wonder what power really means, what legacy really lasts, whether silence is always submission, or sometimes survival. Whether the splendor of a place can outlive the people who built it. And whether memory, when shared, becomes something more than nostalgia, it becomes truth. There is a paradox in the Forbidden City. It was designed to separate, to keep out the world, to contain the emperor's authority, to preserve a sacred order. Yet now, in its openness, it connects, it bridges time, it welcomes not only Chinese visitors, but travelers from every continent. It speaks without words, offering its walls and walkways as conversation between past and present. And as the crowds move through its courtyards, some pause and look up at the sky beyond the rooftops. They imagine the same sky seen by Yongle, by Kangxi, by Puyi. They feel, for a moment, the vastness of history not as something locked away, but as something alive and breathing. For in the stillness of its halls, beneath the fading gold and red, the Forbidden City continues to do what it has always done. It waits, patiently, silently, for those who will come, who will listen, and who will remember. Because no city ever truly forgets.